Hi, class, and welcome to Behavioral Theories of Learning, Week 6. This week we're going to be thinking about, well, what exactly is learning? It's our business, right? But we're going to stop and pause a moment this week and think about, well, what do we mean by learning? We're going to learn about some behavioral learning theories and some principles of behavioral learning. Here's our vocabulary preview for the week. So by the end of this lecture, you should know the definition of these words: operant conditioning, classical conditioning, reinforcers, punishers, shaping, and extinction. So first of all, what is learning? Learning is usually defined as a change in an individual caused by experience. So which of these is learning, if you think about it? A young child taking his first steps, an adolescent male feeling strong attachment to certain females, a child feeling anxious when she sees a doctor coming with a needle, or long after learning to multiply, a girl discovering another way to multiply. So if we go back to our definition, change caused by experience. A young child taking his first step, you might think they do that naturally, but really they learn through experience. First, they have to turn over as a baby, then they have to push up, and then they have to crawl, and they have to stand, and then they finally take those first steps. So that because of that, that's learning. An adolescent male feeling a strong attachment to certain females, do they learn that, or is that an automatic response? I think most of us would argue it's nature, it's biology, it's an automatic response. We don't learn that. We don't learn that the way we do walking. A child feeling anxious when she sees a doctor coming with a needle. Well, most of you might say, no, that's not learning. But if you think about it, why would the child feel anxious when she sees the doctor coming with a needle? Probably because she's had a bad experience previously at the doctor's office where she got a shot. And so from that experience, she's learned to feel fear or anxiety. So that would be learning. Learning comes from experience. Most of us would probably agree that long after learning to multiply, a girl discovers another way to multiply is learning because it's based on previous experiences. So learning is based on previous experiences and it brings about a change. A lot of things are learning, but some things are not. Children are excellent learners. What they learn, however, may not always be what we intend to teach. So this week and next week, we'll be exploring behavioral learning theories as well as social learning theories. Next week, we'll focus more on social learning theories. So let's talk about behavioral learning theories or behaviorism. This way of thinking arose in an attempt to make psychology a science and more objective. Some people refer to it as traditional learning theory. It came before some of the other theories we're going to learn, like information processing later. The focus is on changes in observable or outward behavior. The early work started with animals and transferred to humans. So if you think about it, we have two types of behavior. There's involuntary reflexes. So your heart beats, that's involuntary, breathing, physiological states. If I took a little hammer and tapped your knee, that would be a reflex. And this is associated with classical conditioning, which we're going to learn more about in a minute. But for right now, just think about involuntary reflexes are associated with classical conditioning, or pairing a stimulant with a reflexive response. A second kind of behavior is voluntary. We control that. It's purposeful activity to get something to change. So for example, I can lift my arm. That's not a reflex. I tell my brain sends a signal to my arm and it tells it to lift. I can walk. I can talk. These are all voluntary actions. Voluntary actions are associated with operant conditioning, or behavior changes that are in response to rewards and consequences. And we associate B.F. Skinner with this. So These are very unclear right now. I get that, but just for now, remember classical is involuntary and operant is voluntary. So there are four big theorists in behaviorism, and we're going to talk about two of them today: Ivan Pavlov, Edward Thorndike, John Watson, and B.F. Skinner. What are behavioral learning theories? Well, it started with Russian scientist Ivan Pavlov, who contributed the idea of classical conditioning in which neutral stimuli can acquire the capacity to evoke behavioral responses through their association with unconditioned stimuli that trigger reflexes. Let's see what we mean. So here are three pictures. In the top, we've got a dog, and we've got some food for the dog, the meat. The dog comes up, smells the food, and starts to salivate. You can kind of see the salivation coming out of his mouth. We call the food an unconditioned stimulus, meat. That means the meat is stimulating the salivation. And we haven't conditioned the dog to do that. It just happens naturally. So like when you smell something really yummy, you might start to salivate, pizza or whatever your favorite food is. That's unconditioned. And it just happens naturally. So that's why we call it an unconditioned stimulus. The dog, on the other hand, has the response. He's salivating. And it's unconditioned. We didn't train that dog. That's what conditioned means, trained. We didn't train that dog to salivate. It just happens. So it's unconditioned. It's an unconditioned response in response to an unconditioned stimulus. However, what Pavlov did is whenever he fed the dogs, he started to ring a bell. Dog food goes down, dog comes running over, ring the bell. Dog salivates. Food goes down, dog comes running over, ring the bell, dog salivates. Now, the bell on its own wouldn't cause the dog to salivate. So we call that a neutral stimulus, right? So if you just rang the bell alone, like you see on the right side of the top row, that would be no response. So on the left, we have the meat, unconditioned stimulus, the dog, unconditioned response, salivating. But if I just rang the bell, there would be no response. The dog wouldn't salivate without the meat. So that's all before conditioning. However, as I said, what Pavlov did during conditioning is he paired the bell with the meat, and he fed the dog. Now, the meat is still the unconditioned stimulus because it doesn't require training to get the dog to salivate, right? And the dog still salivates due to the meat. And at first, the bell means nothing. But because we're using the bell to train the dog, we call that the conditioned stimulus when the training's going on. So the dog comes up, sees the meat, eats the meat, the bell rings. We're conditioning the dog. So that's the conditioned stimulus. After conditioning, I know that's a little cut off and I apologize, but the bell, you can take the food away. Pavlov took the food away, and what he discovered is just ringing the bell, the conditioned stimulus caused the dog to salivate. And now, because this wasn't happening naturally, it had been trained, the dog salivating after conditioning, after training, is called the conditioned response. So without the meat, the dog is now salivating. Conditioned stimulus produces a conditioned response. Eureka, everybody said. We could apply that to all kinds of things. Whenever we have any kind of involuntary response, we could apply that. So, for example, if I go to the dentist the first time and I have a root canal, I don't have any fear of the dentist, right? But if I go and I have a root canal and then I have to go back to the dentist again, I might be conditioned to fear the dentist even before I get in to that office. A conditioned stimulus the going to the dentist producing a conditioned response, my fear. So these are the definitions that we just went through. An unconditioned stimulus provokes the response without any prior training, and like the meat provokes the salivation. An unconditioned response is the behavior that results. So, for example, the salivation. A neutral stimuli, which originally has no effect on the response, in this case the bell, and then it later becomes a conditioned stimuli, which a conditioned stimulus, which produces a conditioned response. So whereas Pavlov focused on classical conditioning, or the pairing of a stimulus with a response in a sort of an involuntary way, B.F. Skinner continued that study of the relationship between behavior and consequences. We don't really use classical conditioning in the classroom because it's involuntary. But what B.F. Skinner did is he expanded on that idea and he developed the idea of operant conditioning. And he said, look, if we have these responses to stimuli, could we develop reinforcement and punishment to reinforce or diminish behavior? So, for example, if I'm scared to go to the dentist because I have this involuntary response, it's going to shape my behavior over time so that I might go to the dentist less and less. But if we can apply that in a more positive way, purposefully, to the classroom or to other things, then we're using operant conditioning. Think of operant conditioning as a purposeful application of training someone to do something. So in your classroom, you essentially want to train students to stay in their seats, to raise their hands. So how do you do this? You do it through operant conditioning. He emphasized that we can shape behavior into its desired outcomes. Many educators believe this is an effective tool that may be used for classroom management and improved learning. So again, I want to stress the difference between classical conditioning and operant conditioning. Classical conditioning is automatic. It's an automatic response to a stimuli that's been paired with something else. Operant conditioning is purposeful training using reinforcers and punishers to shape behavior. So here are some principles. Reinforcers increase the frequency of a behavior, whether or not they are pleasant, and punishers decrease the frequency of a behavior, whether or not they are unpleasant. Reinforcers and punishers are different for different students. So if I want to increase a behavior and I want to use positive, some sort of nice positive reinforcer, I might say, okay, class, everybody's going to get 10 minutes of extra recess today if everybody gets this assignment done. But I'm assuming, if you think about it, that everybody likes recess, which probably most of them do. But there might be several students who say, oh, it's going to be cold outside. I don't want to go outside and play. That would not work effectively for those students. So it has to be valuable to the student. Now, the idea is that with reinforcement and punishment, you're either increasing with reinforcement or decreasing the behavior. So if I want to reinforce good behaviors like raising your hand or speaking quietly, I'm going to use a reinforcer. If I want to decrease a behavior, I'm going to use a punisher, like keeping everybody in for recess, if I want to decrease misbehavior, for example. Now, each of these can be positive or negative. Positive means you add something, so you can have positive reinforcement, but you can also have positive punishment. Positive means you add something. So positive reinforcement might be, as you see here, rewarding a student for going to the dentist with a trip to the ice cream store. We're adding the trip to the ice cream store as a reward for going to the dentist. You want to encourage that behavior. Negative, though, means you take something away. So this is a little confusing, but if you think about it, negative says, okay, I'm taking it away, but I'm trying to take something away in order to increase the behavior. So you take something away after a behavior is exhibited to encourage it. So you're usually taking away something negative, right? So, for example, Natalie can get up from the dinner table when she's eaten 2 bites of her broccoli. We want to encourage Natalie eating her broccoli, so that's reinforcement. But we're taking away something negative that Natalie views as negative, the broccoli. We want to encourage her to eat the broccoli, but we're taking it away after she's met the quota. So that's negative reinforcement. People confuse negative reinforcement and punishment a lot. And one of the videos that you're going to watch this week helps clarify that. So remember again, positive means you add something, negative means you take something away. So positive punishment would mean you add something after a behavior is exhibited to make it go down, to discourage it. So for example, giving a child a timeout is positive punishment. You're adding the timeout to get him to stop doing the misbehavior. Negative punishment means negative, you take something away after a behavior is exhibited to discourage it. So for example, if you have a sister or brother, you probably remember fighting over toys, and your mom or dad might have come up and said, okay, I'll take it. Mom or dad taking the toy away to discourage the behavior. So you've got negative punishment and positive punishment, negative reinforcement and positive reinforcement. Now, what do you do in the classroom with these? Well, first of all, you mostly want to focus on reinforcement, not punishment. Save punishment for those very rare instances where nothing else has worked. Reinforcers are often very effective at managing behavior and increasing behavior, good behavior. So the first thing you've got to do is decide what behavior you want from your students. Do you want all students to raise their hand before they talk? Do you want them to use quiet voices inside? Do you want them to stay seated? And reinforce these behaviors when they occur. You have to have some system of reinforcement. Not the best system, but I used to put a little cup on their desk and I would pass out little tokens. And every time I saw them doing something that I liked, I would put the token in. At the end of the week, they could trade tokens. So it encouraged good behavior throughout the room. I'm sorry, I wasn't clear on that. They could trade tokens for treasures from a treasure chest. Tell students what behaviors you want. When they exhibit the desired behaviors and you reinforce them, tell them why. I like how you were sitting in your seat just now. I like how quietly you've been working. Reinforce appropriate behavior as soon as possible after it occurs. It doesn't do any good to wait an hour and then come up and say, hey, I really liked you sitting there, and then give the reinforcement. You have to be immediate. So some teachers ask, well, how often should I reinforce? So what is the schedule of reinforcement? Well, when students must do a lot of work and or when something is coming up the students need to work on, reinforce regularly and frequently. We call this fixed ratio, fixed interval. So for example, if they're working on a project, you could reinforce them every other day for 2 weeks during that project. However, when the workload is normal and nothing is coming up, it actually works better to vary the timing of reinforcement. So random reinforcement. Variable ratio, that means, you reinforce sometimes after 5 minutes and sometimes after 20 minutes, variable interval. This is highly resistant to what we call extinction. So we're going to see later in the lecture and also in the case study that behavioral reinforcement works pretty well for a while. And then students kind of grow bored or they don't want to do it anymore. They forget about it. And then they're at danger of extinction. So you have to have a plan in place to switch them over to something more intrinsic. Shaping is a behavior. So let's say the famous one is that Skinner worked with pigeons. And what he tried to do is he kept them in a little box and he fed them food every time they exhibited a behavior that he wanted to reinforce. And so one of the things he tried to do was to get a pigeon to turn 360 degrees all the way around. So what he found is, just reinforcing the behavior, he couldn't really wait for the pigeon to turn around and then give the food to reinforce it because they didn't do it that often. So what he did is he shaped it. He got them to turn a little bit and then reinforce that. Then when they turned a little bit more, he would reinforce that. And then a halfway around, he would reinforce that. Gradually, he had the pigeon turning all the way around and reinforcing only when it turned all the way around. This is called shaping, giving tiny feedback on each step of a task. And this is when you guide students towards goals. So students aren't pigeons, right? But you can shape their behaviors. So let's say you have a student who is getting out of his seat every 2 minutes and disrupting the class. Well, maybe you can't maybe you can't go for the ultimate goal right away of having that student sit for, a whole hour's lesson. But maybe you could shape their behavior so that you say, I expect you to sit for 1 minute. And then I expect you to sit for 2 minutes and reinforce that behavior. And that's called shaping. Extinction, as I said, is either good or bad. It's when the undesirable behavior will be terminated. But it can also mean when they lose interest in the process. Let's talk about when you want the undesirable behavior to be terminated. Sometimes students come to depend on the rewards and will not perform the task without them. So ultimately, you have to build in a tapering off of the reward, an attempt to transfer students from external to intrinsic rewards, and you have to encourage self-regulation. So what do I mean by all that? So let's think about students tapering off the reward. So instead of giving them a reward every minute, you might go to every 3 minutes, you might go to every 10 minutes. That's sort of tapering off the reward or reducing the amount that we give them. Transferring from external to intrinsic reward is about students learning that it's more rewarding to do something for the sake of doing it or to set goals and to achieve them. And so at first, although they're depending on toys and treats and extra recess time, these are what we call extrinsic rewards. And these become more problematic the older students get because they come to depend on them. The thinking will be, well, you have to give me a reward before I do that behavior. So somewhere at the end of the process, there has to be a transferring to teaching children about goals and setting goals and self-regulatory behaviors that will help them achieve those goals, and then the intrinsic value of feeling good about that accomplishment. And that's where self-regulation, which we're going to talk more about in the course later, comes into play. So what's the vehicle that you can do this? Well, usually it's just done very informally by establishing a system of rewards and possibly punishments in your classrooms. You see these all the time. Class points, earning pizza parties, um, earning ice cream parties, extra recess, all kinds of things. In high school, it tends to transfer into other types of rewards, but the idea is the same. However, in the case of a very difficult misbehavior, students getting out of their seat, ADHD, emotional disorder, you can call into play a contingency contract. And this is a formal written agreement between a teacher and a student that specifies acceptable behaviors the student will demonstrate and the reinforcers that the teacher will award for these behaviors. May also include punishers, by the way. Needs to be very clearly written out. It needs to specify the terms and the dates. It's helpful if you can get a parent involved, and you should have a parent involved to let them know what's going on in school, but it's helpful if you can have like a check off with the contract where there's a communication going on between you and the parent where they initial the contract. And a key factor is should include a component for transference to intrinsic rewards and self-regulation. Otherwise, as I said, the student's going to grow bored. The student will likely stop responding to the reinforcers. And we want students to come off of this so that they understand the value of those intrinsic rewards. So that's just a brief overview of behaviorism. I hope you enjoy the unit. For certification purposes, you need to be able to apply behavioral theories to manage behavior and learning in the classroom. So you need to be able to talk knowledgeably about Skinner's operant conditioning and how that effectively translates into the classroom.